Hi, good morning. Thank you for having me today. I have some notes that I'm just going to read off of my computer. I'm going to hope I can stand. I ran a couple days ago, so my legs are a little shaky. So hopefully this will be okay. It's an encouragement to keep the presentation short, if anything. So the Endangered Species Act turned 50 last year, and few pieces of legislation have had as much bipartisan support and spurred as much controversy as the Endangered Species Act has. But after 50 years, I asked the question, what do we know about the Endangered Species Act? How well has it worked? And what has it accomplished? Now, this is a really hard question, and people tend to have two perspectives that they want to evaluate the Endangered Species Act on. And the first perspective is that of extinction. They say, well, let's look at the ability of the Endangered Species Act to prevent extinction. And the second is to look at the Endangered Species Act and its ability to recover species. So which metric do we choose and why? This is the question that I pondered when I was writing the PERC reports, which are available outside. So first, many would argue that the purpose of the ESA is to prevent extinction, and that it's been very successful in that. They cite that the ESA has prevented over 99% of all extinctions. And while this may be an important goal, to me, it's not the best metric that we can use, because this goal, the prevented extinctions, are neither measurable, nor is it the explicit goal found in the Endangered Species Act. To know if the ESA prevented extinction, we would have to know if endangered or threatened species would have gone extinct had the Endangered Species Act not been in place. In other words, we would need a group of endangered or threatened species that weren't under the ESA that also would have gone extinct, and then we compare that to how species under the Endangered Species Act perform or recover. Now, obviously that group does not exist in this universe, and so thus prevented extinction becomes a hard and nearly impossible question for us to answer. And it's an impossible metric, a nearly impossible metric for us to estimate. So this brings me to my second point and why I tend to focus on recoveries under the Endangered Species Act. So while many might argue that the Endangered Species Act's purpose is to prevent extinction, the self-stated goal of the Act itself and the services stated goal, and the goal that we also are able to actually measure is the ability of the Endangered Species Act to promote the recovery of species. To quote the Fish and Wildlife Services, the purpose of the ESA is to protect and recover imperiled species and ecosystems upon which they depend. So extinction is not a substitute for recovery. Extinction describes a process of intervention, while recovery describes a process of restoration. I would argue that we should evaluate the Act and the progress of the Act based on that stated goal, the goal of the Act itself, which is recovery. And this is why all of my work is motivated by understanding how recovery works under the Endangered Species Act. In Missing the Mark, the report that's available out there, as well as I believe the ESA at 50, which is our kind of roadmap to recovery, so ideas behind how the ESA can be performed, I wanted to think about a way to measure recovery that was fair, since some species may be unrecoverable, so some listed species may never recover under the Act, and other species may take decades longer than they've been listed. So I needed a way to think carefully about how do we look at the recoveries that have happened and gauge whether or not they've been caused by the ESA or infected. And so what I did is I actually looked at how many species the Fish and Wildlife Service expected to recover by 2023. So this is a metric that the Fish and Wildlife Service reports to Congress annually. And they say when a species is listed, for not all species, but some, they say, well, we think we can recover this species in about 50 years, or 10 years, or 20 years. So I looked at all that information and I said, okay, so as of 2023, we've seen 57 species recover under the Endangered Species Act, maybe 58 at this point. So how many did the Fish and Wildlife Service project that they could recover? What do they think they could do in 50 years? Well, they believe that they could recover over 300 species by 2023. So I naturally asked, so what explains this difference? We have 57 recovered, 243 that are kind of ambiguous here. So why is it that the Fish and Wildlife Service's prediction was so far off? and what then leads to a successful recovery of an endangered species. So I decided to look into the recovery plans behind these species. And recovery plans are created by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and other scientific experts. And I wanted to know about the relationship between species that recovered and species that didn't recover and see if they had anything in common. So recovery plans are essentially plans that outline steps that are essential to bring a species to recovery. Each recovery plan has steps within it, and they're deemed as, some steps are deemed as essential, others are steps that need to occur in order along the pathway to recovery, but they tend to prioritize these steps. So they call these priority 1, 2, and 3, and as you all expect, priority 1, they are deemed the most important. So recovery plans are required, and essentially they're supposed to tell us what gets a species to recovery. And they're developed by both scientific experts and service members. So they're supposed to represent the best knowledge about the species. So given all this information, it's natural to think that maybe the ESA isn't recovering species quickly, but maybe the ESA is still advancing species along the way to recovery. So what we might think about recovery itself might be too black and white. You're either recovered or you're not recovered. What happens when we look at species, listed species, and their progress in their recovery plan? So species can have this recovery plan and they have these steps in the recovery plan. And the steps are marked as not started, completed, partially complete. In the report, I detail all the possible ways that you can categorize or label these steps. So I said, okay, let's say partially complete and complete is a step towards progress. So I say, okay, well, where are species? Where are listed species in their progress for the recovery plan? I found that 85% of all listed species lack nearly any progress, which I define as less than 25 of their recovery plan complete. But I thought, okay, well, you often hear that species just haven't been listed long enough. So I said, although 85% of listed species have less than 25% of their recovery plan complete, perhaps this is a story about time. Perhaps species just, if we look at only species that are listed for longer, we're going to see a different pattern. So I say, all right, let me look at my data where I'm looking at only species that have been listed for more than 30 years. So that's a pretty, a generous time to be on the act. And I still find that almost 90% of those species listed for the longest time still have less than 25% of their recovery plan complete. But I wanted to dig deeper to understand what was going on. If time did not explain why species were not recovering, then what else might? Each recovery plan contains actions in it. And so I thought, well, these actions are labeled priority 1, 2, and 3. So maybe we're not making progress in our overall plan completion. Maybe time doesn't really make a difference in how long it takes to recover or progress in recovery plan, but perhaps this is because we're prioritizing priority 1 steps. Maybe we're taking care of the most important things, and that 25% is explaining the priority 1 steps as complete. So in theory, these priority 1 actions are actions that prevent extinction and are the most important to complete. So perhaps recovery plans lack progress, but maybe the service is making progress in priority 1 actions. But this was not what the data showed me. Instead, I found that priority 1 actions are completed more frequently than priority 2 and priority 3. So we're still completing priority 1 before everything else, but they only make up 13% of completed actions. In other words, 87% of other actions listed as priority 1 that must be completed to prevent extinction are left not started, incomplete, obsolete, etc. So what about recovered species? Maybe our listed species, we can't explain recovery or progress to recovery, or we don't see a lot of progress towards recovery. But perhaps recovered species are doing relatively better. Maybe they have more progress in their recovery plans. After all, recovered species should have more of their recovery plans complete. That is, if recovery plans detail critical steps towards recovery. Yet, I found that 72% of recovered species still have remaining steps to be completed within their plan. So to recap, only 3% of all listed species have recovered. So this is the 57, 58 species out of all listed species. And I wanted to understand what contributes to recovery in a measurable and comparable way. So I looked at recovery plans. These plans are required by the Endangered Species Act for any listed species and are developed by experts. They list the steps that must be taken to advance a species towards recovery. The first step I needed to do was identify how far off this recovery metric of 3%, that only 3% of listed species have recovered, how far off is that metric from what the service thought it could accomplish. So the service anticipated by 2023 it could recover 300 species. But recovery doesn't always go as planned, right? We'd like to see this number in the ideal world be 100%. All 300 species that they projected to recover did recover. But we live in reality, and sometimes there are roadblocks, and the real world isn't the ideal world. We can run into funding challenges, we can run into some species just have different population dynamics, but even then, I would argue that we would expect to see a 50 or 75% of that 300, the projected 300 to recover, to actually recover. But instead, we only see 4%. So 4% of species predicted to recover by the service actually recovered. So given this discrepancy, I decided to look at how much progress we were making in recovery plans. Even if we were behind on full recovery, maybe we were making progress in these recovery plans. But again, as I stated earlier, I found that 85% of listed species had less than 25% of their recovery plan complete, and 72% of recovered species still have remaining steps to be completed in their recovery plan. So recovered and listed species, and species listed the longest, look fairly similar. So what actually explains recovery? This question and others can't be answered by my immediate work. All I've found are the differences between these groups. And they're not simple questions, and they require nuanced methods and more data. But in the meantime, my colleagues at PERC have identified areas or possible reasons for why recovery takes time, and also ways that the ESA can be reformed. Primarily, my colleagues look at the incentives that are created by the ESA. Does the ESA align individual incentives like landowners and tribes with the recovery of species, or do these things work against each other? PERC argues that the ESA creates incentives that pit landowners and tribes against the recovery of species, and this could explain some of the lack of progress. We suggest several methods to better align these incentives. We believe that landowners and species can coexist and that recovery is possible without penalizing landowners. In my colleague Jonathan Wood's testimony to U.S. House Natural Resources Committee, the Subcommittee on Water, Wildlife, and Fisheries, at a hearing on the Endangered Species Act at 50, he wrote, "Too few species have recovered due to the failure to account for the incentives of states, tribes, and private landowners whose cooperation is essential to recovering species. The law imposes strict regulations on land where rare species and their habitats are found, effectively penalizing landowners who accommodate rare species and conserve their habitats." He goes on to suggest that protections of species be loosened as progress is made towards recovery, such as species moving from endangered to threatened. This would create incentives for landowners, tribes, and states to play an active role in the recovery of species. And as progress towards recovery is made, there would be reward with fewer regulations. As an example that directly relates to my research, the work on recovery plans, is this idea that recovery plans are often non-binding but required once a species is listed. The Fish and Wildlife's director, Martha Williams, has in an article co-authored with her former Obama administration officials, argued that prioritizing regulatory decisions before recovery plans is a missed opportunity for those regulations to support a larger conservation strategy. So we should use recovery plans to create tangible goals and steps that identify the road to recovery for a species. And as these steps are accomplished and progress measured, we should reward those who actively participate in species recovery efforts with deregulation. Jonathan, my colleague, Mr. Wood, continues to recommend that they permanently ditch the blanket 4D rule and tailor regulations to meet the needs of each threatened species. to use threatened species rules more creatively to give effect to recovery plans and reward states and landowners for incremental progress towards recovery, to reduce delisting conflict, automatically transfer management to states when recovery goals are met, and finally, to revive the ESA's federalism provisions by encouraging states to develop recovery programs and restoring states' veto of federal threatened species regulations. So, in conclusion, after 50 years, it is important to look back on the ESA and recognize both its accomplishments and areas for improvement. During the past 50 years, nearly 60 species have recovered. While this number may seem small, it is important to recognize that it is still an achievement. Further, the ESA, whether successful or unsuccessful, recognizes the tangible and intangible benefits that these species contribute. I do not want to ignore this. But at 50, it is also important to critically ask ourselves, is the ESA contributing to the recovery of species? And if it has fallen short, are there ways that we can improve it such that its ultimate goal of recovery is achieved? I look forward to what my colleagues, fellow panelists, and audience have to say. Thank you for this opportunity.